Hi, all. Here we are, week two, and we're going to be talking about a survey of sociological methods this week, both kinds of methods and the steps that are common to almost any kind of social science research. But first, I want to talk about how to think about doing social science research, what provokes questions, research questions, and how to think about moving forward. For example, the 2016 election. One explanation of what happened is that white voters, especially those with no college degree, moved towards the Republicans in far larger numbers than some previous elections. If you look at this graph, for example, you see that 65% of white voters with no college degree voted for Donald Trump, 29% for Clinton. It was actually much closer amongst white voters with a college degree. And that spread between white voters with no college degree and those with a college degree was considered remarkably different from some previous elections. So that's been at least one explanation out there. But some other researchers said maybe there's something else going on, something that's common often to white voters with no college degree, but isn't actually about having less education. For example, the Economist did a whole study and they had an article called Illness as an Indicator. And in this case, it was an indicator of how somebody was going to vote. Have the URL there for about the article if you want to check it out. But here are some core numbers and graphs from it. This is a graph of every county in the country and whether they voted for like Republican. This is going up the left side, showing the percentage more Republican or less dem or more Democratic. And this is about the swing between 2012 and 2016. The bottom part is what's called an index of county health metrics. This is a pre-existing index that shows how healthy people are, the degree of diabetes, other illnesses, other degrees of wellness and non-wellness. They also have by color showing was the county in the Northeast, the Midwest, the West, and the South. But what you'll see is that the more unhealthy the district, looking up on the left side, you'll see that far more likely to have voted Republican in 2016. While the healthier the county, the more likely they were to have voted Democratic. This is actually a surprising result in some ways, but it does show that there are other indicators besides education that might be playing on the effects of the election. And the fact that lower education, lower income people often are less healthy might show that when you look at lower education, you're actually having a measure of lack of health. So this is what we sometimes call a confounding variable. Like if we are saying that in terminology we discussed briefly last week, an independent variable of having no college education seemed to be causing the dependent variable, meaning whether you're going to vote Republican or Democratic in 2016, what lies behind that might be something like lack of health causing your voting patterns. Now, it's still unclear why lack of health might lead to voting for Donald Trump in 2016, but there are some interesting facts out there. So here's the interesting thing. If you look in Knox County, Ohio, just northeast of Columbus, Mr. Trump's margin of victory was 14 percentage points greater than Mitt Romney's back in 2012. But 100 miles to the east in Jefferson County, the Republican vote share climbed 30 percentage points, far more. So what was the difference? The share of non-college whites in Knox is actually slightly higher than in Jefferson, 82% to 79%. So that's not the big difference. But the residents of Knox, where the jump for Trump was far less, are much healthier. Health index variables explain 43% of Trump's gains over Mr. Romney, just edging out the 41% accounted for by the share of non-college whites. The way you say this is There are ways through statistical analysis to include multiple variables. See which ones remain important once you include all of them in the analysis. And what this says is while the share of non-college whites in a county did matter for the gains Mr. Trump made over Mitt Romney, which compared to 2012, it wasn't as important as how unhealthy the county was. Oddly, looking at the statistical model, if diabetes were 7% less prevalent in Michigan, where Trump ended up edging out um, Clinton, and if an additional 8% of people in Pennsylvania engaged in regular physical activity, and if heavy drinking in Wisconsin was lower, arguably by this model, Clinton would be set to enter the White House. Now, that's not what happened. And whether lack of health is as directly a cause of how people voted, this is showing how higher levels of diabetes, higher levels of drinking, and lack of physical activity seem to be correlated with voting for Mr. Trump. Now, so how could this be explained? It does say that there are ways that health or lack thereof might be standing in for what we thought was just lack of education. But why would that be leading potentially to voting for Trump? Well, here's one thought and one way of looking at the data, which takes you to other ways of looking at the economy, at white working voters. This is from a paper that had got quite a bit of stir when it came out, called Rising Morbidity and Mortality in Midlife Amongst White Non-Hispanic Americans in the 21st Century. What this means is, if you look at the graph, you will see that across most countries, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Sweden, the mortality rate, the number of people dying per 100,000 people, has been steadily declining at a reasonably rapid rate between 1990 and into the present day. This red line is from the US, and that's white non-Hispanic workers. And they're an anomaly basically in the developed world where mortality rates have been increasing amongst this population. This is age 45 to 54, sort of midlife Americans. And one way of understanding this is when we talk about the opioid crisis that's happening in the country. So this ties into this graph, which shows how people have been dying amongst this group, these white non-Hispanics age 45 to 54. Back before 2000, you can see that diabetes has remained roughly the same as the percentage of deaths. Chronic liver disease has increased. But what's really increased is, first of all, suicides, but even more dramatically, this red line representing what's labeled poisonings. Poisonings is often in these statistics another word for overdosing from drugs. And that is what's increased dramatically and is a stand-in for the massive explosion of use, abuse, and often deaths from the opioids out in these various very unhealthy counties. And so while it doesn't explain the role of these opioids in causing the despair, the voting patterns that might lead to voting for Donald Trump, if you think about what we said about Durkheim and suicide and dislocation causing suicide, and in this case, overdoses, why that might lead to voting for Trump in the election is, again, would take further research, but is an interesting factoid for saying that this seems to be an important correlation worth exploring. The next steps on that could go in a number of different ways, and that's part of what we'll talk about. If that was something people were going to explore, whether they would look at interviews with people in the communities, ethnographies for how people are living their lives, whether they're looking at new additional surveys, or other ways of doing statistical analysis on these communities, all of it opens up new questions. And as we said last week, research that opens up new questions that you might not have thought about is often the most important research. So let's start with one other debate here. The question is, how do we think about sociology? Is it a science? And what do we mean by science? There are many people, what would be labeled as critical theorists, conflict theorists, feminist scholars, what are also called symbolic interactionists, ethnomethodologists, postmodernists, have all criticized the idea that you can have a scientific approach to studying society. Now, this can be a question of splitting hairs on the word, but even if sociology isn't science in your view, what makes social research important? First of all, the idea is that it is systematic. You have a plan of action that when you begin, and you execute research according to a plan that has some degree of consistency. You use data. You often use information from primary sources. The work is empirical, meaning you use evidence from the real world, not just theory, to help you figure out what's happening in the world. And this involves analysis. You have to interpret the data to draw conclusions. And the evidence is used to test theories. You start with a hypothesis, you document social trends, you make comparisons over time or across regions, and you gain new insight into phenomena that support arguments in debate. So the question is why social research matters to everyone. Knowing how new knowledge is created and engaging in it yourself is a powerful tool in being able to challenge social myths, the power of elites that produce knowledge. If there's no truth, if we just sort of say whatever is out there, it means that those who have money can pump out their version without a challenge. Partly what social research, by having standards for what we consider valid, having some proof of what's true, helps democratize how knowledge is discussed and interpreted. And in a more practical way, knowing social research and social science, research skills are useful. They're in demand. Business, government, nonprofits, all sectors need people who can conduct various forms of social research. And it makes you a better consumer of social research. You can understand what's useful in whatever field you're involved in and which you're working in. Now, let's talk about the various research methods. The first, surveys. Surveys are in some ways straightforward. You ask people pre-designed questions. You're often familiar with this in the form of polls or other surveys. And what that means is there's a forced choice among alternatives. You're either answering A, B, C, or D. But the advantage of having that forced choice is with limited numbers of answers, you can turn it into statistical data in a standardized form and analyze it. It's often used to see social, demographic trends, attitudes, simple behavior. The second major research method, which we're going to talk about a lot more next week, is interviews. Interviews involve open-ended questions where you don't have a predetermined possible set of answers. People may say something that surprises you, but you hope that they say something that surprises you. And it's analyzed not so much with statistics, although those can be used occasionally with interviews, but usually looking for meaning and themes, things that are common amongst people who are in a same group in some way, and things where they differ. The goal is to see the world from the perspective of those interviewed, to get greater depth on how they see the world, on what behaviors they may engage in, to understand why they engage in them, and how they do it. It's often best for getting people's perceptions, how they're interpreting things, the meaning of social trends. If you saw that people said something in a survey, but you don't know why, an interview is often a good place to find out what was the reason for something happening. If we're going back to the surveys we did on the election, understanding why people being unhealthy might lead them to vote Republican, or being healthy would make them vote Democrat. You might actually see that in the interviews where people talk about why they vote in the way they do. The next kind of research method is observation. As it says, it's a way of watching people to document behavior, seeing things that they do, but might not even observe about themselves. You can see how people interact with one another and find patterns in that interaction. It's often useful for finding behavior people are unaware of, such as differential treatment by race. Like they might not be aware of what they're doing, but by observing, you see people are treating people of a different race, of a different gender, or differences of all sorts of kinds. And you can actually see that correlation just by observing carefully. It gets information that interviews often won't reveal, either because people won't admit something or because they don't even see it in themselves. That people have a lot of things happening in the subconscious that they won't even say because they don't even know it themselves. The next research method is ethnography. Ethnography is very much borrowed from anthropology. Anthropology was once defined by people going off to live in another country, in another civilization, and observing it, living amongst people. And the idea of ethnography is you immerse yourself in a culture or subculture over an extended period of time. It involves formal and informal interviewing while living there, observation, and sometimes content analysis of documents you may find while part of that community. That in-depth understanding of a particular culture helps you identify norms that happen over a whole culture, see values and the meanings that a group gives to their lives on a day-to-day basis. Like each individual person might barely be aware of the norms they live in, but by seeing it operate in groups day to day and how people interact, you get insight that you might not get from any individual interview. The next method is secondary data analysis, which is a way of saying instead of doing, say, a survey yourself, you use somebody else's survey, but you use the data and give new analysis to variables that hadn't been done before. Somebody else has gathered the data, as I said, often survey data, and you can use a computer to do new statistics from the data with new analysis. Many large data collections exist for this very purpose, with large representative groups of people so that the data is statistically useful and the results are statistically significant. The advantage is, since you don't have to pay for your own survey, it's low cost. And if you ask the right question, the question being one somebody else hasn't asked, you may see correlations and results that nobody else has seen. The next research method is what's called existing statistics. This is meaning like secondary data, data that somebody else has collected, but data that, unlike, for example, under secondary data analysis, where the general social survey, which interviews people every few years and often asks the same questions. But when you analyze the general social survey, which we will be doing later in the semester as one of our projects, you actually get into the heart of the data. You can actually ask your own questions of the data, get statistical correlations that nobody else has seen. With existing data, you kind of have to take the data as is. But if you're creative and put one set of data next to another set of data, for example, looking at how people in one county voted and comparing how people voted in counties across the country with data that also exists on how the levels of sickness or illness in a county, you put those together and suddenly you have an interesting analysis of the election. That data on illness and voting is exactly an example of existing statistics. As I said, you have no access to the raw data, but you can analyze these computed statistics and produce alternative perspective or information. You combine the data to calculate examples for how much money spent yields different results in different locations on education or health. And by combining socioeconomic statistics with crime statistics, you can highlight a potential relationship there. Another research method is content analysis. That's where you gather texts, images, songs, other audiovisual products that don't necessarily have words, but they allow you to analyze them for themes and content, style, or form. The idea being that you look at pop culture or particular texts in the field, like even a sex education manual, but you're looking at it not for it as what the people say, but the evidence it gives of that period, of the group that produces those texts. The idea is you find patterns in how music is done, on what people write. For example, if you're talking about how, does music sexually objectify women, you have to actually define that and say what exists in a song that would objectify women and compare it both across different genres or over time. If you wanted to say, does what you consider objectification increase or decrease over time between, say, the 1950s and the 1990s? In each case, you have to look at, and we're going to talk about the process of coding anything from an interview to a song for saying, what is the pattern? And then by assigning it some like status of objectifies women or doesn't objectify women, you can then actually subject it to a kind of statistical analysis. The next one we can talk about is research methods, is experiments. Experiments take two or more groups and alter conditions for one, but not for the other, the control group. The advantage of experiments is you as the experimenter are under control, and you can actually, by the fact that you introduced the change in the outside independent variable, have a much better sense of whether there was causality or not. Now, experiments, as we'll talk about, have come under like quite a degree of suspicion because of some of the more notorious experiments that happened in social science at various points. But they do serve a purpose and are often used, especially since when you can look at the fact that one group where the conditions were altered, you can compare it to the others, it gives you a much better sense of whether what you're doing is working, especially in policy research, where changes in policy are introduced all the time. You want to know whether the groups for which policy changed, if it made things better or made it worse. As I said, it was used more in the early 20th century, but less frequent now. Quantitative versus qualitative research. That is a question you'll hear debated. When we say quantitative, that's anything where the primary purpose is to generate numerical data that can then be analyzed, often with computers today. Um, there are a number of statistical tools that are available for analyzing quantitative data. And the more you have of that, the more people feel numbers are sort of the royal road to understanding. Now, it does seem more scientific, lots of numbers. Computers allow incredibly sophisticated analysis of really large scale numerical data sets. Many prestigious journals in the academic fields publish quantitative research. And that includes everything from surveys, secondary data, experiments, even existing. Qualitative research, however, avoids distilling results just down to numbers, and instead prefers words that highlight the lived experience, the meaning, and norms that are hard to reduce to numbers. It really is important to see where your question is, since which method is important and which one to use really depends on what you're asking. If you're asking for things that are numerically based, you want quantitative research. But if you want to understand the meaning, the lived experience, you really need some form of qualitative research. And there's been an ebb and flow of popularity of qualitative research, but anything where you see interviews, ethnography, there's a qualitative factor in that research. And some research uses both qualitative and quantitative methods, and some methods, say observation and content analysis, often combine both. There's also the question of basic research versus applied research. Research, when it's basic, is done more for academic discussions, academic research. Applied research is much more when it's driven by a particular organizational, governmental, or policy imperative where you want to see a practical result. Basic research is when you want to learn something new to satisfy the researcher's curiosity, but doesn't always have an immediate practical use. Applied research really looks at the practical problems, understanding the effectiveness of a social program in a community, often with the particular goal of improving the policy. So then you have the components of research. All methods include some basic similarities in components of the research. How you approach each component may differ with different methodologies. Methodology itself, it's when you think about it at the highest level, methodology is different from any particular research method. A method is just how data is collected, survey, experiment, or interview. But methodology is the broader philosophical approach to how the research is going to be conducted. It's the questions you are asking at the highest level, the research questions, and they may require different methodology. The one you're probably most familiar with is what's called positivist methodology. That's based on structure, the idea that each experiment or research has to be replicable, and that's often seen as the most scientific approach. Now, when you talk about the research question, this is the core of every single research project. It is the question you're asking, not of the people you interview, not of the people you survey, but really the question you're asking of yourself. What do you want to know? It's the overall guiding question of where you're seeking an answer, the correlations you're trying to test, you're really trying, it's tied often to the methods and the feasibility of research you have based on the question. You have to have a question that's answerable, meaning can you, with the resources available, test a hypothesis and see if it's true or false? And you can only do that if you have the resources to pursue it to the end. So there are some practical constraints on what research question you can ask. You also need to have access to the data that can answer the question. This is especially true when we talk about ethnography, where if you want to live in a community for 2 years, you have to get access there. But it's also true of interviews or a whole range of different methods of can you actually talk to the people you want to talk to answer the question. You drill down not just for what affects something else, but also how and why. Depending on how much you want to know the meaning of the question, that tips you, as we said, towards more qualitative methods. So the research question, the broader idea of what you want to know, will help you decide which method is the one that will be most useful for answering your particular question. And we'll say up front, the hardest work in any research project is getting a research question that's original and feasible, that you can do the research in a way that can be compelling. One way to help you figure out what's worth researching is what's called a literature review, where you see what in this area that I'm interested in, what research has already been done. What do people think was interesting? What results do they have? And what did they find? To be original, you need to search for and read these prior studies to make sure somebody else hasn't already done the research you're interested in. You can look at that literature, though, for unanswered questions, because any good research, when you read it, will say, we figured out X or we saw an interesting correlation, but we still have these questions. And those unanswered questions are where you as a researcher can step in and do your own work. You can find a new angle on an old question. Or if a study has been done with one group, say 50 years ago, it looked at new Irish immigrants and how they were assimilating, you might say, does that pattern of assimilation apply to new immigrant groups, whether Dominicans or Haitians or Mexicans, saying how has the patterns of the past in sociological research held up with new populations? Part of a final study when you publish is to indicate how your research fits into the overall field of study. So you need to have done a literature review. So when you write it up, you can say, here is where my work fits into the broader set of research, because research is almost never going to be expansive enough to stand on its own. You can answer questions that are right on the edge of what other people were asking about and hadn't answered, and you can say to them, as a fellow researcher, here is an answer to questions that others have been interested in and can advance the field in a very specific way. The other issue that comes up in every kind of research is ethics. Are you treating the people you deal with in an ethical way? At any time, research involves power. It is the power of having the resources to talk to people, to often invade their privacy, to create knowledge that will say something about their lives. And so there's ethics in how you get people to surrender the knowledge they have to give it to you as a researcher. Almost all college institutions and most other research institutions have some form of what's called an institutional review board or a human subjects committee. They often require that when you do research, that participants, first of all, be fully informed about the research and give consent to be studied. The idea is to protect them from harm due to their participation, including undue coercion or any other kind of danger. Another big issue is sampling. When you go off to talk to people, you're at some level trying to argue that whatever you say about the people you talk to, that it somehow has implications for a broader population that they are part of. So sampling is a way, in another word, of saying the research you did is representative. How you choose those sources of knowledge is you say you have a pool of potentially similar people, potentially similar groups, and you say, I'm going to take potentially a random or at least a specific way of getting people that they're not so different from the rest of that population. A sampling unit, you may be sampling people, sometimes you're sampling countries or even organizations to say, how do they fit in the overall set of people, countries, or organizations? Usually you're working with people, and the idea is the sampling method can be random, or occasionally there's other criteria, both for practical reasons, but also because of various purposes. The other part is the sample size, is how many people are you going to talk to, survey, look at? How many does it take for it to be compelling that what you're finding that these people say may be representative of broader trends in that overall population? The other part is taking your research question and whatever variables you may be thinking about, you have to make it translate into whether it's survey questions, whether it's interview questions, whether it's way you code to sort of say, this is what I'm seeing when I observe. You have to actually translate broad concepts into specific ways of measuring it. You need to take those concepts and be able to collect concrete data that represents those concepts. Conceptualization is a way of taking a precise definition of a broad concept, and operationalization is taking the information you map onto that concept. The real question is, how will you measure concepts? Research has to be done in steps in ways that then allow you to prepare for data collection that matches those measurements, matches those concepts, and then you do it. Once you've collected the data, hopefully in an organized way that has a good sample, that really has data that matches the concepts you wanted to measure, you have to interpret the data. What patterns do you see? How does it fit into the questions you asked initially? What are the implications of the data for your interpretation? And the results and significance have to be interpreted in light of the methods used and what we would have expected from that method. For example, if you do a local ethnography, you can't definitively say anything about that population in the whole country, but you may be able to have some very interesting ideas about the meaning in their lives, the norms of their community. And then once you have that interpretation from your data, you figure out an audience for the results, write it up, and present as appropriate.